You're listening to the Replatform podcast sponsored by Amplience, an API-first headless CMS and DAM in one. We've partnered with Amplience in 2022 to bring their wealth of industry experience to our audience, gain a fresh perspective on e-com technology and CX from a founder member of the Mac Alliance and a strong voice in the headless community. So today you are listening to the soporific tones of myself, James Gerd, and my co-host, Paul Rogers. How are you today, sir?
I'm good, thanks. How are you doing?
I'm glad that I tried to start this podcast twice and completely cocked up the introduction already. So third time lucky. Let's see how it goes. Welcome back to our regular listeners. Thanks as always for tuning in, and a warm welcome if this is the first episode you listen to. We hope we don't disappoint you, and do subscribe to get episode alerts. We release a new one every Tuesday, and please do like us on Spotify, even Apple, YouTube, etc. We love to get ratings. It helps with our fragile egos. So, Paul, our episode topic today is: what does a good statement of work look like, and what should it include for an e-commerce project? So the top three things I think we're going to cover are: what happens when your statement of work isn't accurate? How do you get your statement of work right, and what needs to be included? And tips for navigating supplier proposals. Does that sound like a fair enough summary?
Yeah, I think it's a very good topic. Always an interesting discussion.
Yes, exactly. And there is never 100% consistent way this is done, hence the reason for wanting to give some advice and guidance based on our experience of projects. So I think the key position is this, right? You need a detailed statement of work for a project, and you can get detailed requirements done prior to going into a discovery phase with an agency. So you can do it internally. It's almost like a pre-discovery discovery. Or you can pay an agency to run a discovery process during which you create the statement of work and get to the point where you sign off at the end of it. We tend to prefer the former. You do an internal piece of discovery yourself first. You define out the requirements, you prioritize them, and that influences the supplier's own discovery planning. And then the statement of work can get refined at the end into more detailed. And the level of detail depends on project size complexity. I think you tend to prefer doing an internal piece first, don't you, before engaging with an agency?
I think it probably depends on the client. I think if it's a bigger project, and also, so I'd say the biggest thing is whether it's fixed scope or variable scope, because I think if you're agreeing, like both of us would be on the client's team, essentially on the client side of the fence. And I think if you're agreeing to a fixed scope project and all of your requirements are broadly covered at a high level, you're in a really good position. And as long as there's enough definition around, quality and the approach, etc., I think you're in a really good position. But if it's variable scope, I think it's really important that you have a lot of definition in that statement of work. I think for me, the big thing as well, particularly if it's a bigger project, if it's a simple project, I think you're kind of okay with less definition. But if it's a complex project, the issue with the typical process is that most agencies will want to do a discovery, which makes perfect sense. They'll want to go into let's say it's between 15 and 40 grand, the discovery exercise. And they will essentially say, we'll do the discovery, we'll define everything, we'll document everything. You can then choose if you want to go into the project or go to another agency. And on paper, that sounds great. But I think that really, if you don't have enough definition initially to get an accurate figure budget-wise, and ultimately I'm trying to protect cost and ensure that the scope of the project is delivered within budget. If you don't have enough definition up front, you're at risk of wasting time with an agency, doing discovery, getting all this documentation, and then having to go to another agency. Realistically, no agency wants to inherit discovery documentation from another agency. They'll still want to do their own. You won't meet your deadlines. The other side is that you go into discovery, you're roughly talking about 100 grand. After all of the discussions, it becomes 200 grand. And then from there, you, depending on whether it's fixed scope or variable scope, or fixed cost or variable cost, you're still then at risk of it then going up again. And I think if it's a complex project, really, you need to have quite a lot done already to know that you're going to have 10% variance versus 50-60% variance in the cost. That's kind of my view on it.
Yeah, I think that's really good, and the level of risk mitigation in terms of effort and detail that goes in before engaging in discovery with an agency is clearly dependent on project scope, complexity of business, etc. So let's start. Our first question was, what can go wrong when statement of works aren't fit for purpose? So let me just fire off like my top three, and then you can riff on whether you agree or whether you've got additional ones. So number one for me, important requirements don't get documented, which results in cost creep later on, which you talked about. That leads to stakeholder dissatisfaction, because if the budget ain't there, those features don't get in, and you might have just alienated a team within the business who can't have what they need. So one example I'll give you from a project, store locator was omitted. This is a project where I came in later on when there was lots of arguments over statement of works. So store locator was omitted. It wasn't referenced. It was referenced, under international. There will be a store locator, but there was no detail of the feature set. So the argument from the agency was, well, we're going to provide a store locator, but actually this isn't what we need, because we need to have Google Maps integration. We've got to have unique indexable URLs for local SEO. We need CMS manageable components on the page for localization. None of that was going to be delivered in scope. That's now adding cost. Second bit, forgetting to include something that's important for overall customer experience and will materially impact quality of the solution. Accessibility is a classic one here. So many statements of works have no provision for accessibility. Are you going in for basic WCAG accessibility level A? Are you getting AA compliance on some? What is the level of accessibility testing? What capabilities are going to be provided? Where will you need to provide external accessibility experts or audits in order to support the project? And my third one is insufficient detail in a statement of work, meaning developers can provide a solution that ticks the box based on a high-level statement, but it fails on one or more e-commerce criteria, such as the user experience. Good example, wish list journey. So I've seen so many where it's like, we'll provide a wish list, customers can log in and add items. But what is the user journey? When somebody clicks on an icon, can you create a guest wish list, which then when they leave, it encourages them to create an account to save it? Or do they have to sign in straight away? How do they add to basket? Can they add all products to basket in one go? Do they have to add each one on one click each? How do they update, remove? How do those items get moved into basket? There's so much detail that you can get to, which will determine whether your statement of work is fit for purpose. So those are my top three, mate. What would you add, or anything else that's more important to you?
Yeah, so I think I guess the obvious one, and like it's carried on from what you were saying there, I think insufficient functionality would probably be the big one, which is kind of what you've already said. But I think dependent on the platform as well, like the approach can have a big impact. So taking your wish list example, if you're working with Shopify, there might be an assumption that you're going to use a third party. That cost might not have been factored into the budget. That might not integrate with other third parties that you want to work with. It might be that, you were expecting a different third party, which might then take longer to integrate. I guess that's like a level of definition you need against, like you say, against each line item. I think where you don't go into that detail, deadline is also at risk. So, quite often I've seen high level statement of works result in people really underestimating a requirement for like even basic areas. Like it might be something to do with PLP or whatever it is, but actually, there's another 4 hours here, another 4 hours here, another 4 hours here. Suddenly, you're not going to hit your deadline because there's another, 10, 20 days of development work, or there's additional QA or whatever that looks like, or more solutions work. And then also in addition to that, if you do have a tight deadline, or even if you don't, that time might then be taken away from somewhere else. And the other one that I've written down, and you mentioned compliance, which is often one corner that can be cut. Performance is another one. SEO is another one. And I guess like you might end up having corners cut if you suddenly end up with a bigger piece of scope in other areas of the project. The other one I think that we haven't talked about yet is, so if you get everything you want off the back of a rubbish statement of work, on paper, you're happy, you've launched the site, but the agency is unhappy. So I think you need to balance that, because a lot of people will put loads of pressure on the agency to take the hit. The agency will lose money. Suddenly the agency actually doesn't really want to work with the client anymore, or they're deprioritized, or they're charging more for all the additional ongoing work to try and claw back some of that lost revenue. And I think you end up with this like fractured relationship. And, there's actually a big cost of moving agency. Like the average agency move probably costs 20 grand or more if it's a really big project. And I think that's the other thing is like, if you actually like enter into a project with an agency, realistically, you should want to work with them long term. So that whole like balance piece, like needs to be maintained.
I think that's a really, really good point, is the relationship side, the impact of getting this wrong. I've seen this arguments where you get emotive conversations, but you said you'd do that, but it's not in the statement of work. But you told us that's not what we meant. And then it erodes trust, as you say, damage the relationship. It also wastes time. If you're spending days or weeks arguing over well, actually, that's time and effort that's distracted from focusing on delivering the project and getting things right. So, you really need to take the time and effort. And I think for those who are new to this, some will already have done this process a few times and maybe learning new points. For those who are new to this, a statement of work is different to requirements that you've defined internally. A statement of work is what your agency partner who's delivering the project will create, which is their schedule of what they're going to deliver for you off the back of the requirements you've confirmed to them. So a statement of work is so important because it's something you can come back to and go, have we got everything we agreed in the project? It can also really help focus your UAT plans. So the relationship is a good one. So let's move on to our second key question then, Paul, which is, what has to go into a statement of work? What are the key areas to consider? So I'll introduce it, and then you kind of tell people what you think is important. So we've already said that we need to start with a scope. So you've got to be clear on your scope and the prioritization, what's critical. And a good starting point is to look at issues that you have now that need to be addressed, requirements and features you depend on in your as-is e-commerce operation that need to be preserved or even enhanced, and future roadmap capabilities to look at what you can get in initially versus what might be in subsequent phases. And that enables you to at least give your supplier a tangible set of criteria against which to provide an initial statement of work. So that's the framing. So where do you look? What things for you have to be in a statement of work?
So I think it's an interesting one. So a lot of the statement of works that I've worked on have essentially referenced a functional specification, which is like a very detailed set of requirements, potentially user stories, all of that kind of stuff that essentially fully defines the scope. So it's the same principle, like a statement, like depending on where you store it, it's the same principle. But I think within that, realistically, when you're kind of going through requirements, I think that you just need as much detail as possible against each requirement, albeit whether you've got, so I guess the key is just making sure that you cover all of your functionality. Because I think the other thing is I've seen people think they have an excellent statement of work. And like you've alluded to, like one of the obvious things is like, oh yeah, I've completely missed something. And you've made a note here of the account section. And like, that's a good example. I've seen it before with Shopify sites where, Shopify has a very basic account section and actually they want to store more fields and they want to allow people to change their email address and things like that. Or they want to pull in orders from other places, etc. And like order and customer migration is another one, like the amount of records and the fields that are actually against an order and a customer and all of that kind of stuff. And I guess you just need to it's on the client side to basically make sure the agency's set of line items covers everything you need. And I think then from there, it's just a case of making sure that there's enough detail that it like fully covers how everything needs to work, both from a front end perspective, a back end perspective, and then also any data that needs to be pulled out of the platform perspective. And I think it's just detail, like functional detail, essentially.
Yes, detail is the key word. I'm going to give a couple of examples of areas that are often undercooked in statement of works. And I spend a lot of time with clients going through their statement of works, pulling them apart in a productive way and saying, right, we need to get this extra info in for you. So number one is integrations. Which integrations are covered within the scope? So, for example, ERPs and OMSs, warehouse management, and how the integration is being done. Is it API based? Is it point to point using existing connectors? Is there customization? Is a middleware being used? If so, which one? And what is covered by this supplier, the e-commerce supplier, versus where? Paul, you raised a good point earlier about in the Shopify world, where often that integration will be done by a middleware third party, not by the Shopify developer. Being very clear on where things are being covered and where they're expected to be done by the client or another person. Yeah. That's one of them. So, this is down to all the third party tools as well. So not just big integrations like ERP and CRM. do you have a UGC plugin like Olapick? Where's your list of third parties that must be connected? You can then go into the functionality that's required for them. And then another one that's really overlooked too much is design and UX. So what is included? Which page types will be designed as part of the design process? Will wireframing be done prior to visual designs? The answer should be yes. Interaction design, how will it be done so you can see how people will meaningfully interact with that page? What happens when they interact with elements on the page, like a mini basket drop down or a slide out menu navigation? What will it look like and what will the transition be? And then page transitions, are there animations? So I worked on a project where the design phase didn't have any animation work specified. And then the creative director got really, really annoyed because they were seeing a flat static page and they wanted to see how things moved in the same way that competitors had really nice animations when you scroll down a page and you interact with content modules. So really important to nail that stuff down.
One huge one to add to that I see all the time is breakpoints and tablet. So a lot of agencies will design mobile and desktop, which on paper makes sense, but completely ignore tablet, and then portrait and landscape tablet are just inheriting mobile and desktop rubbish. And then also the breakpoints just don't work for certain device categories. And that's very common if you just leave a generic statement of work and just crack on.
Yeah, and I like the fact you teased out My Account earlier. A great example of this is there are core elements of My Account that every single e-commerce site needs. You've got to be able to log in, you've got to be able to log out, you've got to be able to view your account information, your profile data, and be able to edit it. Opt-in, preferences as well. Not everyone has a preference center, but from a GDPR point of view, you have to have that core provision to enable somebody to unsubscribe if they're already opted in, to request deletion of their account. So there's compliance issues in there. Then you've got wider capabilities like order history, order tracking, and you suddenly realize it's like peeling an onion. There's all these different elements that a customer expects to be able to access easily. And then you've got to think about, are there any specific use cases for your business model? So for trade, for example, is there any account information like credit? Do you have accounts with credit, and do you need to show what their current credit is, what their balance is? Do you need to show overdue balance? All these things. Do you need to show account statuses? Are there any customizations, like you said, custom fields? That's just one example of one area. If you just put, we'll have a My Account where a customer access their information, it's totally arbitrary. What does that mean? You'll end up in an argument later on about what should be there and what shouldn't. You'll end up being given the default out the box capability, which might not deliver against your user requirements.
And I think the other thing is you need to challenge assumptions. But another thing that I see a lot is, so based on what you just said, so taking some of the B2B requirements. So I guess you've got all of these requirements against the customer and how they see pricing. But yet someone's made the assumption that we're going to use this search provider over here and this product recommendations engine, and they don't support like customer specific pricing or price lists, etc. Same could apply to multi-currency or whatever else. And I've seen the same where like someone wants to use one of these search providers to power the product grid, and they've got all these requirements around like different functionality against the product card, but yet the third party can't physically do it and stuff like that. And that's like, again, more contentious points. So there's just not enough due diligence. One I was going to add, and I'm stealing your points. You've written here edge cases, and one of your edge cases is donations for charity. And I think with the SaaS projects, particularly Shopify, a lot of the agencies will really focus on building a like best-in-class theme, and that's like by far their biggest focus. Something like donations for charity is something that has a lot of impact on like your integration, on tax. Like, yeah, there's like loads of little considerations. And I think if you're a small business and you've got a non-technical team, small team, you don't want to have to think about that really. You want the agency to think about that. You want the third party, if you're using a third party, you want it to be selected with all of this stuff in mind. If you're building a private app, you want the quote to be based on all of this stuff. And I guess that's like one example, but that's one of the big things that I see come out of bad statement of works is just that little lack of detail for things that seem quite simple, but they're not.
Yeah, and I think this is the key point on this episode for everyone is, if you have a line in a statement of work for a capability or a feature, explode that into explain exactly how it needs to be delivered. What is the front end requirements? What are the back end integration pieces? are there any implications, like you said, for tax and duties? If there's adding a cost into a checkout, but it's tax exempt, is that specified so that you don't end up with inaccurate costing to customers, or poor and inaccurate reporting leading to reconciliation issues for finance teams? So, and there, by the way, anyone listening, on our website, the web post for this, we'll put a list of all of the key high level areas that people should think about included in their statements of work. At least it will give you a hit list to go through. It won't give you the details behind each, but it will give you that, how do we have a provision for this? And tax and duties is a classic one, Paul, for international especially. Yeah. Do you have such a wide product range where you have like different tax rules based on different product categories? How are you handling tax and duties for international? Are you integrating with a third party like AvaTax, Avalara? Are you using the platform specific? Do you have custom engine that you need them to integrate with? It really pays to get into the detail, because these things can either derail the project, as you said, or it can suddenly add a load of development costs later on.
I think one other thing that I just thought of is that obviously in this scenario, we're talking about the kind of broad statement of work for the agency, like delivering the project, but increasingly project teams are being split out. So like you might have a designer, you might have an integrations company and platform, etc., and they need really detailed statements of work as well. And one of the ones that I was just thinking about, so like returns is an interesting one. So like if you're charging duties and the customer has to pay duties, like how does that work from a returns perspective? And like exchanges is another one that's like increasingly complex when there's more third parties involved. And I guess, all of this stuff needs to be like teased out, and kind of in some ways you'd probably have it in both, and you need to figure out how you're going to essentially say statement of work with the integrations company, statement of work and the with the SI, but you also then need to think about allowing for time for collaboration and stuff like that. I do think this all requires like a certain level of project, but I think this is where projects fail, and I think both of us have probably seen projects like fail as a result of not having this detail.
But also, for me personally, it applies to every single project, regardless of size and complexity. Yeah. It's just a question of how much detail you go. You have to have a statement of work, otherwise you're going to be screwed later on, because you've got nothing to. How do you build out a UAT plan if you don't know what's meant to be delivered and all detail? Even at a simple level, just a simple set of requirements in a statement of work, and whether the statement of work references a requirements list that's elsewhere, like you said, or it's in that statement of work, it helps UAT to go, right, we've got 80 criteria to test against. Brilliant. One really tangible example for people listening: internationalization and SEO, domain structures, site versions. One project I got involved in a real heated argument because a client's expectations around domain structure for their primary UK site and their international domains to be on subfolders was not compatible with how the platform worked by default with subdomains. And all of a sudden it said, but we were on subfolders. Oh, but that's not how this platform works. Yeah. And to try and create a workaround, there are ways of doing it, but it now adds complexity and it now adds cost. Or can we work to the way the platform works and accept that compromise from an SEO point of view? We can still manage the sites, we can still get SEO visibility, we can still set things like href tags, etc. But it's a different way of working. And is that the path of least complexity? But not having this defined up front means there's a mismatch. And one of the important parts of discovery is setting out your stall of what you want to achieve, and the agency being able to provide an upfront estimate of what they think the project is, and through discovery, teasing out the optimal solution with compromise, at which point that cost gets refined and both sides buy into what the recommended solution is.
I think that is a good point, and I think that ties into, but highlights something. So in a modern day project with all of these new platforms, I think back in the day when it was mostly Magento and Salesforce, you didn't have too much room for issues if you have a complex international site, whereas now I think a lot of people go and sign with some of these new platforms, even like the kind of best of breed API first one, and there's a lot of consideration around how you structure these stores. So like as an example, BigCommerce and Shopify, in most instances you'd end up with multiple stores if you've got multiple warehouses and need to pay out into different bank accounts, everything else. In that scenario, you might, like you mentioned hreflang, you would have to build a logic to allow for hreflang. If you've got multiple warehouses across multiple stores, there needs to be something in the middle that says this product is available in this warehouse and it's not in this one, etc. And that's the kind of thing that will always be left out. And then another one is accounts. So I've spoken to so many people that have had global accounts on Magento or Salesforce. They've moved to a SaaS platform, and actually then you need to start thinking about a single sign-on across the different stores and everything else. And as much as I think in most cases people are willing to compromise, it's always an argument, and it shouldn't need to be an argument. And I guess that's another one. I just think the multi-store piece is actually where, in like the types of projects I work on, where a lot of this comes up, the kind of like contentious pieces that haven't been covered.
Yeah, exactly. And this is the whole point: is if you're working on a platform, you have to understand how it works natively, where that might be different to what you ideally wanted to achieve from a functional point of view, and whether customization, or even considering doing something like going headless to avoid some of those limitations around like domain structures, URL paths, even down to things like we want to be able to index filtered pages when people are on PLPs and they're filtering by different attributes. And some platforms by default don't filter anything, don't index anything that's filtered. And therefore you have to think about how you would resolve that. Is it that important? Does it have to be done? If so, that needs to be flagged, because that needs to be understood and estimated, so you don't either get disillusioned later on with cost or have your pants pulled down over adding cost. Right, let's think of some other things quickly to add in that need to be thought about. Statement of work is making sure that you've got specified by the agency what's out of scope in their deliverables and why. And I've worked with a few clients where we've looked at capabilities they might want to do but aren't prioritized as defined in their MVP scope, and therefore are not costed within this current statement of work, and being very clear on that to say you will not get these 4 or 5 things. We know that they're important. We know that there's subsequent phases, but we have not estimated for them now. So there's no argument later of, we thought that was also included. And then we need to get on to, I guess, the core kind of project delivery stuff. So project management, delivery, their resourcing, who's going to be on it, how they're doing development, development standards and controls, their QA process, project management tools, documentation, account management provisions, SLAs, training, what's covered, what's additional, fees and optional, and then all the line-by-line cost model and payment schedule and terms and conditions. So, if it's 120 grand, when are those cost lines payable, and on what point, what triggers it?
Do you know one that I think you just touched on? One that I think is really important that kills me is, and not in a bad way, because I think this is just how people work, but it's a frustration on the client side, is that testing piece. So a lot of agencies will test desktop Chrome on a MacBook, and the website will be perfect. But the minute you start using it on the most commonly used Windows device in, Firefox or whatever browser, maybe not Firefox, but another really common, important browser to business, website's terrible, things just don't work, formatting and layouts all over the place. And I think all of that stuff needs to be in here as well, because that actually can have a big impact on timeline. Again, you lose loads of time, can't get through the full UAT backlog, you end up launching or compromising. I think fast followers is a really important one. Every agency in the world is at 120% capacity at the moment. Most of the projects I've worked on, one of the biggest arguments throughout the whole project is we agreed we'd do a fast follower and you don't have capacity to work on it. And it's not even the cost side of it, it's just that people just don't have the time. So I think that's another thing you should try and allow for. Basically, the agency ring-fenced a sprint off the back of the project for anything that gets missed, be it at their cost or your cost.
Yes. Yeah, good point. Okay, so let's move on to our final question, which is how can you effectively evaluate a supplier's proposal statement of work? So let me give my thoughts on that, and then you can kind of riff again on what else and maybe build out on some of those. So Number one, so I'm going to list key things that I would do. Number one is I would compare the statement of work versus the agreed scope and requirements we've got. At a high level, is everything included? The things that have been defined as out of scope, is anything contentious and would materially impact the quality of the project? Next bit is, does it fix the known issues? Based on our internal discussions, all of the current issues we've got that we're trying to fix, will it address them? If not, which ones won't it? What's those gaps? Then you can review with your business stakeholders. Are we willing to accept that, or do we need to get those plugged? Does it cover the important as is? The stuff you've defined as, we need this, customers depend on it, our business needs it. Are they included so that you don't go backwards in your capability? Is it aligned with e-commerce good practice? So say something like gift cards or tax handling. Is it really good and fit for purpose, or is it going to cause any user experience issues or any problems for you and your business and operations? And then last one is key stakeholder needs. Our digital marketing team, our e-commerce team, our merchandisers, whatever it is, do we think that it's given enough provisions for them so that they'll come out of this being able to sign off on the project? And then the last one is it within budget? So have we lost complete control over what our original budget and focus is and created something that's a complete monster? So those are my sense checks and go-to points. How about you?
Yeah, I think you've covered pretty much everything there. I think key one really is just line item level. Is there enough detail? Is like the equivalent of your acceptance criteria of that requirement covered? Yeah, I think that's probably the big one. I think it's not necessarily an evaluation piece, but I guess as a client, I think the one thing you should probably try or need to do is just be aware of process change and compromise. And maybe that's something to document because I think, Shopify is a good example. The platform that I work with the most, you're going to compromise, you're going to have to work in different ways. And I think as long as you're aware of it and the people that are making the compromise are aware of it, it's fine. But quite often people aren't. And again, that's another one. And it's not necessarily, it shouldn't be in the statement of work, but it definitely comes off the back of the statement of work. And what's listed in the statement of work will impact it. Yeah,
that's a really good point, actually. Knowing when to compromise and when not. So that's we've covered the three elements we want to do. Why is it important? And what needs to go into it, and how do you evaluate it to make sure it is fit for purpose? If you could leave one part in comment, one bit of advice for teams who are going through this or planning it, what would it be?
I think, dependent on the business, I would say bring someone. If you don't have the team to do this level of due diligence, bring someone in that does. Even if it's like you bring someone in for 2 days and they literally just go through everything with a fine-tooth comb and, govern the scope of the project. I think that is often very valuable. And there'll always be people that have done it before, or, that are an expert in the platform, or, consultants, etc. I think that's a very good use of money, personally.
Yeah, mine is similar, but it's more about don't rush into working with your agency partner, even if they're already selected, and don't just accept their discovery approach that they've given you. Take the time, think about it, get organized, get structured, get a meaningful set of requirements delivered, not just a spreadsheet with 20 lines in saying we want an ERP. What does that mean? What does that integration need to deliver? Get that detail, give that to an agency or prospective agency and say, right, how would you deliver your discovery based on this to make sure we cover all of these points in, and make sure when they give you a proposal back, you look at it and go, have they covered all of those areas? Do we feel confident? If they're saying we're going to do all of your integrations in a half-hour call, be a little bit afraid that they haven't provisioned enough time, basically. So that's the one. Well, look, thanks for listening, everybody. Keep an ear out for the next episode. As we said, they land every week, usually on a Tuesday. And let us know of any topics or guests you'd like us to cover, and let us know why. Subscribe if you haven't already. And we'd love a rating on Apple or Spotify if we haven't sent you to sleep. So thanks for listening, and catch you next week. For more information on this topic, head over to replatform.fm for our audio podcasts. To discuss a project, or if you'd like to chat about any of the topics covered in this episode in more detail, please reach out to myself, James Gurd, or my co-host Paul Rogers via LinkedIn and Twitter. Thanks again for listening, and keep your ears peeled for the next episode.